It began, as many of my memories of Oxford do, with bells. The slow, rounded chimes of Merton drifted across the High in the fragile light of early evening, and I found myself pausing beneath the rain-dark stone, staring up at a sky the colour of extinguished candles. Bells in Oxford are not merely instruments of time, they are reminders of history, pressing its thumb upon the present, indifferent to the men and women who quicken their pace along the cloisters. That night I could not shake the sense that they were tolling not for the hour, but for something hidden or perhaps already lost. Lewis, practical as ever, had tugged his collar tighter against the drizzle and remarked, half to himself, that bells always made him feel uneasy, as though the city knew something before we did. I let the thought linger. He would never have put it in those words, of course, but that was the essence of it. The bells were heralds, summoning us into what was to come. We had been called to Merton by a letter from the college bursar, a letter written with the kind of hesitant strokes that suggest more is being withheld than revealed. An incident, the bursar had said, a matter requiring quiet inquiry, that was all. I had taken the summons less as a request than as a lure, and perhaps I was foolish enough to feel flattered that Oxford, in all her guarded secrecy, sometimes thought of me still. The porter admitted us with the perfunctory courtesy of a man who has stood too long in draughts. He smelt faintly of wet wool and pipe tobacco. His glance at me was not quite steady, as though he had already guessed that the news we carried away would not be kind. Behind him the lodge lamps burned low, and the long passage beyond was silent, except for the creak of its boards under our weight. In the quadrangle, the rain had softened to a mist that clung to the stones and blurred the edges of the lanterns. I have always thought Merton to be more austere than its neighbours, less given to ornament, more inclined to severity. That evening it seemed positively funereal. And yet, even then, before I knew the details, I felt a small shiver of recognition. There had been a death, and the college wanted its hush preserved. We were led to the chapel, where the air was sharp with the residue of incense. A few candles remained lit near the altar, their flames wavering with the draughts that crept through the old glass. And there, against the shadow of the choir stalls, stood the bursar, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on the ridge of his nose, his hands clasped together as though in prayer. He looked not at us, but at the stone flags at his feet. "There has been an accident," he murmured, though I suspected from the tightening of his jaw that the word was chosen with care. A fellow of the college, Dr. Julian Fawkes, was discovered in the organ loft not 2 hours ago. The verger, preparing for evensong, found him. His head struck the wooden railing. A fall, so it seems. But you understand why we hoped you might. He left the rest unsaid, and the bells outside filled the silence with their slow lament. I asked to be shown the loft. Lewis and I followed the bursar up the narrow spiral, our steps echoing off the stone, each turn of the stair making me feel as though we were circling inward toward the heart of some concealed design. At the top, the air grew colder, carrying the musty odour of old timber. A constable had been stationed there, a young man with anxious eyes, clearly eager for someone of greater certainty to relieve him. The body had already been taken away, but the shape of the fall remained imprinted on the place. A scuffed mark on the rail, a faint smear on the stone where the head must have struck, and something else, a handkerchief tucked oddly behind one of the organ pipes, as though dropped in haste and hidden by accident. I reached for it, noting the faint scent of sandalwood. Men seldom use sandalwood. Lewis asked if it might belong to the verger. The bursar said quietly that it was embroidered with a monogram not the verger's, but a woman's. I slipped it into my pocket without a word. A death in Oxford is never merely a fall. From the loft one could see the full spread of the chapel, the pews dark as coffins, the lectern glinting faintly in the candlelight, the faint shimmer of rain on the windows. I imagined Fawkes leaning over the rail, his weight suddenly gone, and the echo of his body striking stone before the bells called the hour. But what struck me more was the absence of sound in that moment. No cry, no footstep, no hurried departure. Silence where there should have been disturbance. It was then that a line from a crossword I had worked that morning returned to me. The clue had been a fall without sound, and the answer mute. Strange how the mind retains such fragments, placing them beside the scene of a man's death. Fawkes's fall had been mute in every sense, as though muffled by intention. The bursar told us Fawkes had been a historian, a scholar of recusant writings. Brilliant, reclusive, prone to fits of melancholy. He had few close colleagues, fewer friends. Yet he had enemies enough, if one listened to the undertones in the common room. He had been preparing a lecture on certain controversial manuscripts, and there were whispers of impropriety not financial, but scholarly. Oxford, like all old cities, hoards its secrets, and scholars are rarely forgiving when one of their own threatens to reveal too much. I asked whether he had a family. A sister, the bursar said. She lives in North Oxford, and a niece who sometimes visited the college. I thought then of the monogrammed handkerchief and wondered which of them it had once touched. As we descended the stair, the bells began again, their notes thick with mist. I felt a weight in my chest that was not merely fatigue. Death in Oxford has always seemed more final than elsewhere, as though the stones themselves conspired to remember every fall, every silence. Lewis, sensing my mood, tried to offer some practical comfort. Perhaps it was only an accident, perhaps the railing had given way, or the man had been dizzy, but I shook my head. Accidents do not leave monogrammed handkerchiefs scented with sandalwood. Accidents do not arrive so silently. That night, as I walked alone along the High, the rain pooling black at my feet, I thought again of the bells. They had tolled at the hour of Fawkes's death, though he could not have heard them. Or perhaps he had, and it was their summons he answered when he leaned too far. In Oxford, it is never the living who own the silence. It is the dead. And as the bells of Merton faded into the damp air, I knew, though I could not yet have said why, that this was no accident. It was the beginning. The porter had a face that seemed made for suspicion. Heavy-browed, with eyes that gave the impression of having watched too many generations of scholars pass under the arch without ever trusting them fully, he stood at the edge of the porter's lodge like an old sentinel. I have known such men before. They see much, say little, and remember everything, though one must coax each detail as carefully as a gardener prizing moss from stone. After leaving the chapel, Lewis suggested we speak with him at once. I agreed. Oxford's porters may know more than the dons, though their knowledge is of a different order. Fragments of gossip, comings and goings, midnight quarrels half-heard, bottles smuggled under coats. The things that never appear in any official record. The rain had strengthened outside, tracing the stone with a faint glisten. Inside the lodge it was warm, the smell of damp coats mixing with the faint tang of tobacco. The porter invited us to sit with the formality of a man who had never truly considered his lodge to be a place of comfort, and after a few awkward moments he began to speak. Dr. Fawkes was a restless soul, he said, up late, often walking the Quadrangle after midnight. He had seen him only last evening, passing under the arch with his coat collar raised, carrying a sheaf of papers bound in red twine. The porter's voice dropped then, as if to confess a sin. He had heard Fawkes muttering, angry words, though he could not catch them all. Something about betrayal, something about truth being buried. I asked whether anyone else had been seen in the college that night. The porter paused, his eyes narrowing in thought. Yes, there had been a visitor, a woman cloaked against the rain, who came just after dusk. She had asked for Dr. Fawkes by name and had been admitted without question. She had not signed the book, and that, he said, was unusual. Lewis, ever the pragmatist, asked if he could describe her. The porter frowned, then shook his head. Not clearly. The hood of her cloak had hidden her face. She moved quickly, with purpose. But here he hesitated again. She had worn gloves of pale leather, oddly elegant for the weather. Such details, the porter said, stick in the mind. It was then, as he shifted uneasily in his chair, that I noticed his hands. They trembled faintly when he reached for his pipe, though his voice had remained steady. There are many causes for trembling, fatigue, and even fear. But in the porter's case, I thought it might be guilt, not guilt of action, but of omission. He had seen more than he was willing to admit, and now that knowledge was burdening him. I let the silence stretch until he filled it. There was something else. After the woman departed, sometime before midnight, he thought Fawkes had returned across the quad, his papers gone. He looked unsteady, almost ill. The porter had thought to ask if he needed help, but before he could, Fawkes had vanished into the chapel. That was the last time he saw him alive. The bells tolled faintly again outside, and I found myself considering the rhythm of the night, the woman's arrival, the disappearance of the red-tired bundle of papers, and the scholar's final walk into the chapel. It formed a sequence, though the meaning remained veiled. Lewis leaned toward me and whispered that it might have been blackmail. Papers exchanged in secret, anger afterwards, and a fatal fall. Perhaps. But I thought again of the monogrammed handkerchief, scented with sandalwood. Blackmail is rarely perfumed. I asked the porter if he remembered what direction the woman had come from. He nodded slowly. From the Turl. He had watched her pause under the street lamp, as though she were uncertain whether to turn back. Then she stepped through the gate. I wondered if she had heard the bells even then, calling her into the secret history of that evening. There was another detail, small, almost negligible, yet it fixed itself in my mind like a pin. The porter mentioned that Fawkes, in his final crossing of the quad, had dropped something metallic. A coin, he thought. It had struck the stones with a sharp ring. Fawkes had not stooped to pick it up, but hurried on. Later the porter had looked for it, but found nothing. Perhaps it had rolled into a drain. Or perhaps someone else had retrieved it. A coin that rings against stone. The image clung to me. That morning's crossword had offered a clue I could not solve, token of betrayal tossed aside. The answer eluded me still, but I felt the coin and the clue belonged together. Perhaps the city itself was teasing me with riddles. The porter grew restless, shifting in his chair, and finally muttered that he had said all he knew. I suspected otherwise, but pressing further would yield little tonight. Men like him reveal themselves slowly, in layers, each visit drawing forth another reluctant memory. As we left the lodge, the rain had eased again, leaving the quadrangle slick and glistening. Lewis exhaled heavily, muttering about how little we had really learned. I disagreed. We had learned that Fawkes was not alone in his final hours. We had learned of papers exchanged and anger muttered in the dark. We had learned of a woman in pale gloves and a coin that vanished. These were not answers, but they were fragments of a pattern. And in Oxford, fragments are rarely without meaning. I paused then, gazing across the quad toward the chapel windows. Their faint glow reminded me of eyes half-shuttered in sleep, watching but unwilling to see. Fawkes had walked that path with unsteady steps, burdened by knowledge, or perhaps by guilt. The woman had entered before him and left without signing her name. Between them lay the truth, hidden like a monogram in a fold of silk. Lewis asked if we should seek out the verger next. He would know more of the loft of the moment when Fawkes was found. I nodded, though my thoughts lingered on the porter's trembling hands and his careful omissions. He had told us much, yet withheld more. The truth of Oxford is always like that, half-whispered, half-erased, waiting for the ear that will not stop listening. As we stepped back into the night, the bells began once more, their notes washing over the stones like dark water. I thought of Fawkes again, his last mutterings of betrayal and truth buried. The porter had heard them, but I had felt them, resonating through the quadrangle, carried by the bells. Somewhere in the city, the woman in pale gloves was walking home through the rain, perhaps carrying the red-tied bundle of papers. Somewhere else, the missing coin lay hidden in shadow. And above us, the bells of Merton went on tolling, as if to remind me that Oxford remembers everything, even when men try to forget. I have never liked the sound of coins on stone, too final, too accusatory. That night, it seemed, the whole city had heard it and was holding its breath for what would follow. The senior common room is a place that has always unsettled me. Too much oak, too many portraits staring down from darkened walls, and a silence that tastes not of peace but of rivalry. It is a theatre where civility masks animosity, where academic titles matter more than the lives that bear them. That evening, it seemed especially airless, as if Dr. Fawkes's absence had unsettled even the varnished tables and leather chairs. Lewis and I entered with the bursar's reluctant blessing. A few fellows remained, their gowns discarded, their voices hushed, as though they feared the walls might repeat their words. A decanter of port sat untouched, which told me much. Scholars do not willingly leave good port alone unless the atmosphere is too bitter to drink in. One man, grey-haired, with a face like creased parchment, looked up as we entered. "This is a dreadful business, Inspector." He spoke in the manner of one who wished us gone quickly, lest the police disturb the fragile hierarchy of the room. I told him gently that we only sought to understand Dr. Fawkes's final hours. At the mention of the name, a flicker passed across several faces of discomfort, perhaps even relief. I have always found it revealing when silence follows the mention of the dead. Grief is noisy guilt, however, it is quiet. The senior common room had its factions. Some leaned together in whispers, others pretended to read newspapers already folded flat. I let the silence linger before asking who had last spoken with Fawkes. A younger Don, nervously tugging at his sleeve, admitted that he had debated with him in the afternoon over the authenticity of a manuscript. Fawkes had been insistent, even aggressive, that his interpretation was correct. The younger man flushed as he recalled it, then subsided into silence. The grey-haired fellow interjected that Fawkes was often intemperate, too eager to prove himself. He had alienated many of his colleagues with wild theories about Catholic recusant writings, suggesting they concealed hidden codes of loyalty and betrayal. At this, another Don muttered that such notions were not merely eccentric, but dangerous reputations could be ruined if one pushed too far. I asked if Fawkes had any enemies here. The silence was thicker this time. Finally, the bursar cleared his throat and said only that Fawkes was not universally admired. That was an evasion if ever I heard one. I wandered toward the fireplace, noting a half-finished crossword abandoned on the side table. The clue above caught my eye. Unseen rival concealed in room, The answer had been scrawled in a shaky hand shadow. I allowed myself a faint smile at the aptness. Shadows were all I saw in this room, cloaked in academic courtesy. Lewis bent to examine the newspaper, but found nothing else. I, however, noticed a small smear of wax on the hearthrug, as though a candle had been set down carelessly. Odd, since the room was lit by electric lamps. It suggested a private meeting, a conversation conducted in half-light when the others had gone. Who had met there with Fawkes, and why? I asked whether Fawkes had attended dinner the previous evening. A woman's voice answered low, precise. She had been sitting by the window, almost unnoticed until now. Yes, she said, Fawkes had dined but left abruptly before dessert. He seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. She remembered because he had spilled a little wine on the tablecloth, and she had thought it unlike him to be so careless. The small details often matter more than the grand gestures. A spilled glass, a half-solved crossword, a smear of wax. They accumulate into patterns that others dismiss, but which I cannot ignore. Lewis asked whether anyone had followed Fawkes when he left. The woman shook her head, yet she added, after a pause, that she had seen the young librarian glance after him with unusual intensity. A rivalry of scholarship, perhaps, or something more. The port remained untouched, and I found myself gazing at its deep red glow in the decanter. It reminded me of blood, though that was a cliché I usually resisted. But the thought lingered. Fawkes had left the room under that watchful gaze, carrying his papers, perhaps already aware that he was walking into danger. I let my eyes travel once more across the fellows, the younger Don's flushed face, the grey-haired man's guarded hostility, the woman's precise detachment. Each carried a fragment of the truth, and none would willingly give it up. Oxford protects its own, even when they despise each other. It was then that I made a small deduction, quiet and unprovable, but insistent. The wax on the hearthrug suggested a candle carried secretly. A candle implies darkness, privacy, and fear of discovery. Someone had wanted to meet Fawkes away from the scrutiny of the common room's light. But why here, when the college offered so many hidden corners? Unless the choice itself mattered, unless the meeting was meant as a challenge, a confrontation in the very room where reputations were made and unmade. Lewis muttered under his breath that the Dons were a cage of cats, hissing at one another yet bound by the same walls. He was right, but among them one cat had bared its claws last night, and Fawkes had not survived the encounter. I asked finally about the woman the porter had seen enter the college. At this, faces stiffened. No one admitted knowledge, yet the silence itself told me they knew more than they wished to reveal. Secrets in Oxford are never solitary. They multiply like ivy, covering every wall. As we left, I glanced once more at the crossword on the side table. Shadow. It seemed almost too pointed, as if someone had left it for me deliberately. Or perhaps I was imagining patterns where none existed. Yet I have learned not to dismiss such coincidences. They are the city's way of speaking. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the stones slick and shining in the lamplight. Lewis walked beside me in silence, his breath faintly visible in the cool air. The bells were quiet now, but their memory lingered, heavy as ever. The senior common room had given us no answers, only shadows. Yet I knew that in the shadows truths waited patiently. And Oxford, in her own time, always reveals what she has hidden. I thought then of Fawkes's last walk, the red-tied papers gone, the woman in pale gloves stepping through the gate, the coin ringing on stone. And somewhere, in the half-light of the common room, a candle had burned low, leaving only its smear of wax as witness. Shadows, yes. But shadows lengthen as the sun departs, and in their slow stretching, they point, however, faintly toward what lies at their centre. Mornings in Oxford are seldom as bright as outsiders imagine. The spires may glimmer faintly when the sun obliges, but more often the light seeps through as a dull wash, illuminating little, softening nothing. That morning was one of those skies, the colour of wet parchment, and the streets were still slick with last night's rain. Lewis arrived with his coat, buttoned high, carrying a folded sheet of paper that the porter had handed him not half an hour before. A student had written it. The hand was hurried, almost panicked, and the paper itself bore the faint creases of someone who had read and reread before deciding at last to deliver it. The letter, unsigned, claimed knowledge of Dr. Fawkes's dealings, knowledge that would not be safe in the open. The student offered to speak if we met discreetly in the Radcliffe camera, at the far corner where the shadows gather beneath the dome. Anonymous letters are a tradition in Oxford, as old as the Quadrangles themselves. Yet this one felt different. It was not the petty malice of undergraduates amusing themselves. It carried a weight, the desperate tone of someone caught between fear and conscience. Lewis frowned, muttering that it could be a prank. But I told him, fear leaves marks on the page. You can see it in the uneven pressure of the pen, the slant of lines that do not quite hold steady. Whoever wrote this had trembled. Ink, I have always thought, reveals more than speech. We waited until the appointed hour. Inside the Radcliffe the air was thick with the musk of old bindings, and the silence was of the kind that deepens rather than relieves thought. Readers bent over their books in pools of lamplight, oblivious to us. At the far corner, beneath the carved shelves, a young man shifted nervously, his gown too long for his thin frame. His eyes darted toward us, then away again. He did not introduce himself, but pressed a folded page into my hand and whispered that he could not be seen speaking. Then, with a glance over his shoulder, he vanished among the stacks. His departure was so swift it seemed rehearsed. The page he gave us was not his own writing, but a copy of a letter in Fawkes's hand, though unsigned. It spoke of manuscripts, of a discovery that could alter reputations, perhaps even topple a career or two. There was mention of betrayal again, the word underlined twice. Fawkes hinted that he had found proof of duplicity in a colleague's work, proof that would destroy him if revealed. The tone was fierce, almost exultant, as though Fawkes relished the thought of exposure. Lewis muttered that it sounded like a threat. I thought it sounded more like a challenge. Fawkes had never been one to keep his discoveries quiet. He would brandish them like weapons, and in Oxford, weapons of that kind are deadly indeed. The student's copy contained another clue, though small. At the bottom corner of the page, smudged but legible, was an ink blot shaped almost like a star. I had seen such marks before. Some scholars use blotting paper carelessly, leaving behind a telltale pattern. If we found the original, we could match it to Fawkes's hand. Lewis asked what it proved. Nothing yet, I admitted, but a blot can betray a hand as surely as a fingerprint. We left the Radcliffe and stepped into the pale light of the square. The Sheldonian loomed across the cobbles, and beyond it the Bodleian stretched like a fortress of secrets. I felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the sense that Fawkes had uncovered something he was not meant to, and that Oxford itself had conspired to silence him. That afternoon, we traced the student to his rooms. He was reluctant, pale, with the look of one who has studied too long without rest. He admitted that Fawkes had entrusted him with the copy, instructing him to keep it safe should anything happen. Fawkes had spoken of enemies, of colleagues who would rather see him dead than see the truth revealed. The student had been terrified, unsure whether to believe or dismiss him until the bells tolled and the news of the fall spread. He would not name the colleague Fawkes had accused. Fear closed his lips. Yet his eyes flickered toward the shelves where a volume stood oddly out of place, a book of recusant poetry, its spine frayed, a slip of paper protruding. I reached for it and found a note in the same hurried hand as the earlier anonymous letter. It contained only 3 words: "Trust no one." There is something peculiarly chilling about warnings so stark. They admit no compromise, no nuance, trust no one. Yet Fawkes had trusted this student enough to give him the copy. Or had he merely used him, knowing the boy would be too frightened to do anything but hide? As we left, I considered again the language of Fawkes's letter. Betrayal, proof, duplicity. The words were chosen with deliberate care, as though meant not just for the recipient, but for posterity. Men who fear death rarely underline their accusations. Men who seek victory do. It was later, over a solitary pint in the King's Arms, that I turned to my crossword and found myself staring at a clue I had left blank. Bearer of hidden truth, 5 letters. The answer slid quietly into place. Angel. Odd, perhaps fanciful, yet it lingered. Was the student meant to be an angel carrying Fawkes's message after death? Or was the angel a darker figure, cloaked in pale gloves, delivering something altogether less divine? Lewis returned from his errand with little more than a shake of his head. The college remained tight-lipped. The dons preferred silence to scandal. That was always their way. But the letter, the student, the blot of ink, these were cracks in the facade, and through them light would eventually seep. That night I walked past the Radcliffe once more. Its dome glowed faintly against the mist, a lantern of learning and secrecy alike. Somewhere inside its walls a student trembled, clutching the memory of a dead man's words. Somewhere else a rival don counted his victories in silence. And above it all, Oxford's bells waited to sound again, each note a reminder that time in this city is never merely measured, but judged. The letter lay folded in my pocket, its words pressing against me like a pulse. Betrayal, proof, duplicity. They echoed in my mind as I crossed the cobbles, and I wondered not for the first time whether it was the living or the dead who spoke more clearly in Oxford. I knew only that Fawkes's voice had not been silenced. It had merely changed medium from man to paper, from sound to ink. And ink, once spilled, can never truly be erased. Music has always haunted me more deeply than words. Words one can argue with, rearrange, dismiss. But music seeps beneath resistance, bypasses reason, and lingers in the marrow. That evening, when Lewis and I entered the chapel once more, it was music that greeted us, the choir rehearsing for Sunday evensong, their voices threading through the arches like incense, solemn and strangely fragile. The organ, too, joined them, though less confidently. A student sat at the bench, his fingers faltering on the keys, his face pale in the candlelight. The choirmaster, patient but firm, corrected him with a tap of the baton. Again, boy, with feeling. I stood at the rear, letting the sound coil around me. The chapel had been the scene of death only a night before, yet now it seemed determined to cloak itself in harmony, as though melody could overwrite memory. But the floor beneath those voices remembered. Stone does not forget. The verger, a stooped man with the air of one who had served long without recognition, joined us quietly. His eyes flickered to the loft where Fawkes had fallen. He whispered that he could still see it, the body crumpled against the flags, the silence broken only by the faint hiss of candle wicks. He shuddered. The music, he said, did not comfort him. It only made the memory sharper. I asked whether Fawkes had been in the habit of visiting rehearsals. Sometimes, yes. He liked to sit near the loft, scribbling notes while the organ shook the rafters. He claimed music revealed truths hidden in words, though few understood his meaning. Perhaps it was madness, perhaps not. Lewis asked about the night itself. The verger's voice grew heavier. He had come early, as was his custom, to prepare the hymnals and trim the lamps. He had found the loft door unlatched unusually. When he entered, Fawkes was already lying there, blood pooling beneath him, the rail marked by the blow. And there had been, he insisted, the faint smell of sandalwood. That detail struck me again, sharp as glass. The handkerchief I had pocketed carried the same scent. Fawkes had not been alone in his final moments. Someone had stood close enough for the fragrance to cling to the air. Someone had left the door ajar. The choirmaster halted the rehearsal then, irritated with the organist's mistakes. He turned toward us, his gown swaying like a metronome. "A dreadful business, Inspector," he murmured, though his eyes betrayed more curiosity than sorrow. He claimed to have respected Fawkes, but there was a dryness to the words that suggested otherwise. When I asked if he had seen anyone near the chapel that night, he hesitated only briefly. A woman, perhaps, near the cloister door. He had thought it was an imagination, a trick of the rain. Pale gloves, the porter had said, a cloak drawn tight. Now a shadow near the cloister door. The figure moved across accounts like a refrain, returning in different keys, never fully resolved. As the choir resumed, I watched the students. Some sang dutifully, eyes fixed on their scores. Others glanced toward the loft, unable to resist the magnet of tragedy. One, a boy in the front row, sang with eyes closed, his voice startlingly pure. But it was his hands that caught my attention. They trembled slightly as he held the music sheet. Not from fear of notes, he knew them well, but from something else. Shock, perhaps, or knowledge. After the rehearsal I approached him. His words came haltingly. He had seen Dr. Fawkes in the chapel 2 nights earlier, long after practice had ended. Fawkes had been speaking with someone in whispers. The boy had not dared to stay, but he remembered the rhythm of the voice, quick, sharp, female. And when the loft door creaked, he ran. He swore he had told no one until now. Lewis asked if he recognized her. The boy shook his head, but he remembered the color of her gloves when she lifted her hand to her ivory face, almost glowing in the candlelight. Ivory gloves. The detail echoed through my mind like a minor chord. Each witness added a note, and together they formed something perilous, unresolved. Later, when the chapel was empty, I lingered near the organ loft. The faint smell of dust and candle wax lingered, along with the memory of the verger's whisper. I studied the door. Its latch was old, worn smooth with use, but it did not easily spring open. Someone had left it deliberately unlatched that night. Accidents seldom arranged themselves so neatly. Lewis stood below, gazing up at me, his face shadowed by the dying light. He called softly that it might all have been despair. Scholars do take their own lives, after all, but I could not believe it. Despair does not wear perfumed gloves. Despair does not leave monogrammed silk in hidden corners. Despair does not whisper in the dark before the fall. It was then, staring down at the pews, that a stray clue from the crossword returned to me. 4-letter word for harmony, undone. The answer was rift. The choir had sung of harmony, yet beneath their voices a rift had opened. Fawkes had stood on its edge, and someone else had been there, nudging him closer. As we left the chapel, the bells tolled again. Their sound mingled with the faint echo of the choir, as if the city itself were rehearsing some darker liturgy. The verger crossed himself hurriedly. Lewis sighed. I merely listened. Oxford stones bear many rehearsals, choirs, debates, conspiracies whispered under arches, but only some are remembered. Others end in silence, a silence punctuated by bells and by questions that refuse to quieten. That night, as the rain began again on the cobbles, I thought of the boy's trembling hands, the ivory gloves lifted in the candlelight, the faint smell of sandalwood that clung to the loft. A choir had sung for the living, but the dead, I felt, had been listening too. And if I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Fawkes among them, his voice no longer raised in anger, but folded into the harmony of shadows, waiting for someone patient enough to distinguish the rift from the chord. It was in the bursar's office, dim and heavy with the smell of old paper and lamp oil, that the photograph was placed before me. A simple thing, no larger than a postcard, its edges curled with age, its surface faintly smudged by the fingers that had passed it from drawer to drawer. The bursar had produced it with a reluctance that made me suspect he wished it was destroyed rather than studied. Yet he offered it nonetheless, as though conscience had finally outweighed caution. The photograph showed a group of scholars gathered in front of the chapel, gowns flapping like ravens' wings, faces caught in the uncertain half-smile of men, unused to the camera's gaze. Among them, unmistakable even in youth, was Julian Fawkes. His eyes already carried the distant intensity I had seen in death. But it was not Fawkes who held my attention. It was the figure standing a little apart from a woman, her face obscured by the brim of a hat, one gloved hand resting lightly on Fawkes's arm. Lewis leaned closer, muttering that women seldom appeared in such photographs of that era. True enough. Colleges then were jealous of their cloisters, and outsiders, especially women, were admitted rarely, reluctantly. Her presence there spoke of privilege or defiance, perhaps both. I studied the hand. The glove was pale, almost luminous against the dark cloth of Fawkes's sleeve. I felt a tightening in my chest. Ivory gloves, the choirboy had said. Pale leather, the porter recalled. The past and present overlapped in that single gesture. Whoever she was, she had remained near him, shadowing his life as she had his death. The bursar murmured that the photograph had been taken more than 20 years earlier, when Fawkes had first joined the fellowship. The woman was believed to be a patron's daughter, though no one could remember her name. She had visited briefly, then vanished from college life. Some whispered she had died young, others that she had married abroad. No record, only speculation. Oxford often prefers speculation to certainty. Lewis asked why the bursar had kept the photograph hidden. He looked away. Because it troubled him, he admitted. Because Fawkes had never spoken of her, yet her presence lingered. Because the image seemed to watch him when he tried to forget. He had thought it unwise to show it, but now, with Fawkes dead, he felt the weight too heavy. I turned the photograph over. On the back, faint pencil marks, 2 initials intertwined, JF and CM. The letters were written in a hand, not Fawkes's, a woman's hand, I thought, from the looping flourish of the M. The ink had faded, but the intention remained. CM, who was she? A niece, perhaps, or a sister's friend? A patron's daughter, as rumoured? Or someone else entirely a presence who haunted him quietly for decades? I slipped the photograph into my pocket and left the bursar staring at his desk as though relieved of a burden. Outside, the quadrangle gleamed wet under a sudden burst of sunlight, the stone dazzling after so many days of rain. Yet the brightness only made the shadows deeper, and I found myself searching the faces of passing students for echoes of the photograph. That evening, I walked to my room, the photograph resting on my desk beside the folded copy of Fawkes's letter. Betrayal, proof, duplicity, and now initials that whispered of intimacy. The connections were faint but insistent, like a half-remembered melody one cannot dismiss. I poured a whiskey and opened my crossword. The clue at the top read 6 letters, memory captured in silver. The answer came at once. Too easy, I thought, almost mocking. Yet it was precisely the kind of clue that inserts itself unbidden into a case as if the puzzle maker were conspiring with the dead. Later, Lewis arrived with a small discovery of his own. He had spoken with the college archivist, who remembered a visitor inquiring after Fawkes not long ago. A woman, middle-aged, carefully dressed, who asked for him by name but left no contact. She had been polite but distant, and carried a scent the archivist had struggled to place, something faintly exotic. "Sandalwood," I suggested. Lewis nodded grimly. We compared the archivist's description with the photograph. Time changes faces, but the essence remains. Could the woman in the picture and the visitor in the present be the same? If so, then she had returned after decades, drawn back into Fawkes's orbit only to vanish again on the night of his death. The photograph had become a bridge between past and present, and on that bridge Fawkes had fallen. I lay awake long after Lewis had gone, listening to the wind against the window panes. My mind replayed the fragments, the porter's tremor, the choirboy's whisper, the bursar's reluctance, the initials penciled in haste. I imagined the woman standing in the chapel loft, her gloved hand brushing the rail, the scent of sandalwood rising as Fawkes leaned too far. Accident or design? Affection or betrayal? The photographer refused to say. Oxford is full of photographs like those frozen moments, their meanings altered by time. But this one felt different. It was less a relic than a message, slipped forward from the past into my reluctant hands. When at last I drifted into uneasy sleep, it was the image of the ivory glove that remained, luminous against dark cloth, poised forever between comfort and push. The invitation to dine with the dean arrived in the same stiff envelope the college had used for centuries, the sort of stationery that seemed to carry not just ink, but expectation. Lewis looked at it doubtfully, muttering that dinners seldom produced anything except indigestion, but I knew better. In Oxford, dinners are not about food. They are rituals, performances, and sometimes confessions whispered between courses. That evening the hall was lit by chandeliers that trembled slightly in the draught from the old windows. The tables were dressed with white linen, and the silver caught the glow of candle flames. The smell of roast beef and wine mingled with something older polish on wood, the faint musk of stone warmed by centuries of gatherings. The fellows filed in with a practiced ceremony, gowns brushing the floor. The dean, a man whose age seemed elastic, somewhere between 70 and eternal, presided with the bland smile of one who has witnessed too many scandals to be surprised by another. He greeted me with courtesy, but his eyes remained unreadable. Lewis sat beside me, already restless, shifting as the Latin grace was intoned. He whispered that he preferred chips at the pub. I ignored him. I was listening to the silence that followed the prayer, the collective clearing of throats, the low hum of knives and forks. Every sound in such a hall is a statement, every glance a footnote. Fawkes's death hovered over the dinner like smoke. No one mentioned it directly, but pauses fell too often, and laughter when it came was brittle. The dean finally raised his glass. "A sad loss," he murmured, and we all drank. Some drank deeply, some barely touched the rim. I noted the distinctions. The man seated opposite me, the grey-haired fellow from the common room, spoke with forced heartiness about manuscripts, attempting to steer the conversation elsewhere. Yet his eyes avoided mine, and I suspected he knew more than he wished to admit. Next to him, the young Don shifted uneasily, his fingers worrying at the stem of his glass. Fear sits poorly at dinner, but it cannot be disguised. When the second course was served, a small incident occurred. A servant placed a dish before the dean, and as he reached for his spoon, a folded paper slipped from beneath his napkin. He covered it quickly, but not before I caught the edge of a monogram with the same initials I had seen penciled on the back of the photograph. CM. My pulse quickened. Lewis noticed my glance and muttered under his breath. I nodded. Someone wanted the dean to be reminded of something or warned. That paper had not drifted there by chance. In Oxford, nothing drifts. The conversation turned to Fawkes at last, though cautiously. The woman fellow by the window spoke of his brilliance, tempered with a sigh about his stubbornness. Another mentioned his lectures, increasingly erratic, filled with hints of conspiracies in old recusant texts. The dean listened but did not contribute, merely tracing the rim of his glass with one finger. It was that finger that gave me pause. A faint ink stain marked the side, as though he had been writing only moments before. I thought of the note beneath his napkin. Had he written it himself, or had it been placed for him? Dessert arrived, rich and sweet, though I tasted little of it. My attention was caught by a phrase spoken softly by the young Don. He wanted to reveal too much. It was said almost as if to himself, but the words hung in the air. Reveal too much. That perhaps was Fawkes's crime. Not discovery, but disclosure. Lewis leaned toward me and asked whether I thought the dean was complicit. I shook my head slightly. Complicity in Oxford is never simple. It is not a single act, but a chain of silences, each link forged by fear or ambition. The dean's silence was heavy, but silence does not always mean guilt. Sometimes it is merely survival. Coffee was served, strong and bitter, and with it came port. Glasses glowed red in the candlelight, and tongues loosened a little. The bursar, his nerves soothed by drink, began to ramble about old benefactors and their daughters, one of whom he could not recall. The name had once been close to Fawkes. A ripple passed through the table, quickly smoothed over, but I caught it. The woman in the photograph, the initials on the paper, the pale gloves seen in the chapel, she was no ghost. She was remembered, if only in whispers. It was then that a small deduction stirred in me. The crossword I had carried in my pocket contained a clue I had not solved. 5 letters, secret, shared at table. The answer revealed itself as I listened to the shifting voices of toast. A word both ordinary and ritualistic, the moment when words are spoken aloud yet disguised as courtesy. And tonight's toast, a sad loss, had been precisely that, a secret shared, meaning understood only by those who knew its weight. When the dinner ended, the fellows filed out slowly, their gowns trailing like shadows. The dean remained seated, staring at his untouched dessert. I approached him quietly and asked if he had known the woman in the photograph. His eyes flickered just once, then steadied. He said nothing, but the silence was not enough. Lewis and I stepped into the night air. The rain had returned, fine and persistent, soaking the stones until they glistened like black glass. I felt the heaviness of port and secrets both. The bells had not yet sounded, but in their absence I heard them still, echoing in imagination. The dean's dinner had yielded no confession, yet it had given me something else, the certainty that Fawkes's death was less an accident than the inevitable coda to a composition begun decades earlier. The woman, the initials, the photograph, the scented gloves they threaded through every account, like a motif hidden in a symphony. And one day soon, that motif would resolve into something final. For now, all I carried away was the faint aftertaste of port and the image of the dean's ink-stained finger, tracing the rim of his glass as though he, too, were working at a crossword clue he could not quite bring himself to solve. False solutions arrive more easily than truths. They slip into the mind with deceptive neatness, offering patterns that please the eye, but collapse under weight. That evening, in the dim hush of my rooms, I believed for an hour that I had solved Fawkes's death. The whiskey glass beside me was half drained, the crossword folded, the photograph propped against the lamp. It seemed so clear then, as many things do when one wishes them to be. The narrative arranged itself with the ease of a well-set table. Fawkes had discovered proof of deceit in a colleague's scholarship. He threatened to expose it, brandishing his manuscript as a weapon. The colleague, desperate, had enlisted the aid of a woman, perhaps the mysterious CM, who confronted Fawkes in the chapel. There, amid whispers and sandalwood, she had urged him to silence. When he refused, a struggle, a fall, an accident, yet not entirely. It sounded convincing, too convincing. Even Lewis, when I outlined it the next day, nodded with satisfaction. "That makes sense," he said, "but Oxford seldom makes sense." I tested the theory against each fragment: the handkerchief with its monogram, the porter's tale of pale gloves, the choirboy's whisper of voices in the loft, the dean's ink-stained finger. Each seemed to fit, yet uneasily, like mismatched pieces forced into a puzzle. I knew, even as I spoke, that it was wrong. The weakness lay in the coin. The porter had heard it strike the stones, a metallic note that echoed longer in my mind than in the quadrangle. My neat solution ignored it, pushed it aside. And any theory that requires silence of an inconvenient fact is already false. That evening, seeking air, I walked across the High. The lamps glowed faintly in the mist, and the bells marked the hour with a weary cadence. I found myself at the Bodleian, its dark mass looming like a fortress. I remembered the student's letter, the copy of Fawkes's note with its ink blot, and I wondered whether the truth lay not in the chapel at all, but in the library's silent stacks. Lewis caught up with me, coat collar raised. He asked whether I truly believed the woman had killed Fawkes. I said only that belief was dangerous. We must deal in possibilities, not comforts. He shook his head, weary of my evasions. But evasions are sometimes closer to truth than declarations. We entered the library with the warden's permission. Midnight pressed against the windows, and the air smelt of dust and vellum. Our footsteps were absorbed by the thick carpets, and the silence was of the kind that grows heavier with each breath. I led Lewis to the recusant section, where Fawkes had spent so many hours. There, amid Latin spines and brittle bindings, his presence lingered. A faint indentation on the reading desk, a slip of paper tucked carelessly into a folio. The slip was no more than a student's note, a translation of a passage about loyalty and betrayal. Yet it bore, at the margin, a doodle, a small star drawn in haste, the same star that had marked the blot on Fawkes's letter. My false solution wavered. Why mark both with the same symbol unless it was deliberate, unless he wanted someone to see it? Lewis asked if it mattered. I told him yes, because patterns, once glimpsed, refused to leave. The star meant something to Fawkes, though to what it pointed I could not yet say. As we stood there, a draught stirred the shelves, and somewhere a floorboard creaked. We were not alone. A shadow passed along the far aisle, too quick for certainty. By the time we reached it, the place was empty. Only the faint smell of sandalwood remained, mocking us. Lewis swore under his breath. I said nothing. The presence of the intruder did not frighten me. It confirmed that we were circling closer. False solutions seldom attract resistance. Truth does. We left the Bodleian after midnight, the door closing behind us with a sigh. Outside, the city lay hushed, the cobbles slick with new rain. Lewis asked what I thought now. I admitted my earlier theory was too neat, too eager. A false solution designed to soothe rather than to pierce. The real pattern lay elsewhere, half hidden, and the coin was always the clue I could not dismiss. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword once more. The clue at the center stared at me. 7 letters, an answer that deceives. The word came reluctantly, illusion. That was what I had woven, what Lewis had believed. An illusion, fragile as candle smoke. I poured another whiskey and stared at the photograph of Fawkes and the veiled woman. Ivory gloves, initials, a star, doodled in margins. Each fragment pointed, but not yet in the same direction. My task was not to assemble them into the pattern I wanted, but to wait until their true alignment revealed itself. Patience is a detective's hardest discipline. Before sleep claimed me, I wrote in my notebook a single sentence: beware the answers that come too quickly. It was a warning to myself, but also, I felt, to anyone who might read these pages later. For in Oxford, as in life, it is not the false solutions we fear most. It is the truths that arrive too late. It was Lewis who noticed it first, though he gave it no weight. A faint mark on the inside cover of a vellum-bound folio tucked away in the recusant section of the Bodleian. He pointed it out with the casual air of a man idly turning pages, more concerned with the stiffness of the binding than the meaning of the words within. I leaned closer, brushing the dust aside, and saw it properly. The inscription had been written in ink long since faded to sepia, though the letters retained their firmness. Not a signature, but an assertion. Veritas vincit, truth conquers. Beneath it, almost invisible, was a second line JF and the familiar star sketched clumsily, the same star that had marked Fawkes's copied letter, the same that appeared in the margin of the student's note. The motif had returned, insistent, undeniable. Lewis muttered that it was probably nothing more than an old scholar's flourish, but I shook my head. Nothing repeated so carefully is an accident. Fawkes had adopted the star as his private cipher, a way of binding his discoveries together. And here, hidden in a book whose dust suggested it had been untouched for years, he had left another message. I asked the librarian about the volume. She told me it had been consulted only rarely by specialists. Fawkes himself had ordered it more than once, and intriguingly, another scholar had requested it within the past month from a visiting researcher from abroad, though she could not recall her name. A woman, nonetheless. Pale gloves in the chapel, initials on the photograph, sandalwood lingering in the air. The figure grew clearer, though her outline remained shadowed. The inscription itself gnawed at me, Veritas vincit. But truth in Oxford seldom conquers. More often it is buried, suffocated under layers of scholarship and silence. Perhaps Fawkes had written it not as conviction, but as defiance. A declaration against the forces closing around him. I traced the star with one finger. It seemed childish at first glance, but there was something precise about its angles, as though drawn with thought. A code, perhaps, or a reference to a particular constellation. I remembered that Fawkes had once lectured on symbolic readings in recusant poetry, pointing out hidden allegories in the most mundane phrases. Could the star be more than a doodle? Lewis, impatient, asked what it proved. I told him it proved nothing yet, but pointed out. The corner of the folio's binding was slightly frayed, and behind it a slip of paper had been pressed. I teased it free. A small scrap, no larger than a visiting card, bearing only 2 words, "They know." The handwriting was unmistakably Fawkes's, though shakier than usual, as if written in haste. They know. Who were they? The Dons, the Dean, the woman with the gloves? It was not clarity the note offered, but a deepening of the fog. And yet, paradoxically, such deepening was progress. A false solution brings calm. A true path brings disquiet. I folded the slip and placed it with the photograph and the letter in my notebook. My pocket now felt heavier than its weight justified, as if the dead themselves pressed against me, demanding to be heard. We lingered in the library until the lamps were extinguished one by one, leaving only a pool of light where we sat. The silence deepened, and the air grew cold. At last the librarian approached, murmuring politely that it was time to close. Her eyes flickered to the folio in my hands, and for a moment perhaps I imagined it a shadow of fear crossed her face. She knew more than she would say. But librarians in Oxford are guardians of silence as much as of books. Outside, the night had thickened into fog. We walked slowly across Radcliffe Square, the cobbles slick beneath our feet. Lewis was tired, his patience strained. He asked again what it meant. I told him about the crossword clue I had solved the night before. Illusion. A false solution that pleases. This, I said, is different. The inscription is not an illusion, it is testimony. But testimony, like scripture, can be twisted. He muttered that I was growing fanciful. Perhaps, yet fanciful thoughts have their own precision. I recalled another clue from that day's crossword, 8 letters written in stone, hard to erase. The answer was inscription. Too neat, perhaps, but undeniable. The puzzle maker and Fawkes were conspiring, I felt, each leaving marks for me to find. We reached the lodging house where Fawkes's niece was staying. A lamp still burned in her window, a faint square of gold in the fog. I considered knocking, but the hour was late. Better to let her dreams remain unbroken for now. She, too, might hold fragments of truth, and I would need her clear-eyed. Back in my room, I laid the photograph, the copied letter, and the slip, with the "they know" across the desk. 3 fragments, joined by a symbol of the star. I stared until my eyes blurred, but no solution came. Only the quiet conviction that the star pointed somewhere, that it was not mere ornament. I poured a final whiskey, the liquid burning as it settled. Outside the bells rang midnight, muffled by fog. Their sound carried strangely, as though absorbed by the mist, returning to me altered, distant. I closed my eyes and thought again of the inscription. Veritas vincit. Did Fawkes believe it, or did he write it as one might carve a gravestone, knowing the truth would lie buried beneath? The fog pressed against the window panes, and the room seemed to shrink. In such hours, when the city sleeps and one is left only with ink and silence, false solutions tempt the mind, yet the inscription held me steady. It was not an answer, but a compass. And compasses, though they waver, do not lie. I wrote in my notebook, "The star returns." The truth is not yet spoken, but it has been written. And as I laid down the pen, I felt the weight of Oxford itself lean closer, whispering that the dead speak more truly in margins than the living ever will at dinner. The confession, when it came, was not shouted or wrung from its speaker. It arrived softly, as many truths do in Oxford, borne on the weight of accumulated silences. The tutor had summoned me after hall, asking in the mildest tone if I might walk with him through the cloisters. The rain had paused, leaving the stones glistening as though varnished, and the lamps cast faint halos in the mist. His voice, when it began, trembled, not from fear of exposure, but from exhaustion, as if he had carried the burden too long. He spoke first of Julian Fawkes's brilliance, a brilliance edged with cruelty. Fawkes had delighted in cornering colleagues, in prizing open their arguments until they bled. Some admired him for it. Others hated him. The tutor belonged to the latter group. Yet hatred, he admitted, was not the whole. There had also been admiration, reluctant but undeniable. It was that mixture which had made Fawkes unbearable. I asked whether his quarrels with Fawkes were recent. The tutor nodded. Only weeks earlier, Fawkes had accused him privately, but with relish of falsifying a source in his commentary. The accusation had been untrue, he insisted, but the possibility of such a rumour spreading chilled him. In Oxford, reputation is as brittle as stained glass. One crack and the whole pane shatters. Lewis, walking a pace behind us, muttered that this sounded motive enough. The tutor glanced at him briefly, then back at me. He said he had indeed confronted Fawkes on the night of his death. In the chapel, after rehearsal, when the candles were nearly spent. They had spoken in whispers, voices carried upward into the vault. He admitted anger, he admitted pleading. He even admitted that he had placed a hand on Fawkes's arm, urging him to relent. But he swore that he had not pushed, had not struck. When Fawkes leaned over the rail, he claimed he was alone in his gesture. And yet, as he spoke, I could see the flicker of memory in his eyes, something more than guilt, something less than innocence. I let the silence draw out until he filled it with another admission. He had not been alone with Fawkes. A woman had been there, standing just beyond the loft door, half-shadowed, saying little. Her perfume had been sandalwood, her gloves pale. She had slipped away before the fall, leaving only the faintest touch of fabric against the wood. Lewis looked at me then, a spark of vindication in his gaze. The woman again, always the woman. But to me it was less satisfying than unease. The tutor's words had not cleared the fog. They had thickened it. We stopped beneath an arch, where the drip of rainwater echoed like a metronome. I asked if the woman had spoken Fawkes's name. The tutor shook his head. She had said only one thing, quietly before leaving. Beware. The word lingered in his ear. He said, even now, beware. I considered the inscription in the library Veritas Vincit. I considered the slip of paper they know. And now this whispered word, beware. Warnings multiplied, each fragmentary, each shaped to obscure as much as reveal. Oxford's truths are rarely declarations, they are riddles disguised as cautions. The tutor pressed his hands together as though in prayer. He confessed that he had wanted Fawkes silenced. He confessed that he had imagined, in moments of anger, the fall. But imagining is not the same as doing, he insisted. And as he spoke, I believed him, though belief is a dangerous indulgence. Lewis asked what had become of the retired bundle of papers. The tutor's face hardened. He claimed ignorance. He said only that when Fawkes left the hall that evening, he carried the bundle still. After his death, it was gone. Someone had taken it, perhaps the woman, perhaps another. He could not say, or would not. We parted at the cloister's end. The tutor walked away slowly, shoulders bowed, as though lighter for having spoken, yet heavier still with what he withheld. Confession, I reflected, seldom cleanses entirely. It muddies the water, even as it clears a path. Later in my room, I opened the crossword again. A clue awaited me. 9 letters, burden shared. The answer came with reluctant clarity, confession. The tutor had shared his burden, but only partly. A half-confession, like a half-truth, weighs more heavily than silence. I poured a whiskey and let the word roll in my mind. Confession. Fawkes's death was surrounded by them in letters, in whispers, in inscriptions on library walls, each a confession of something, yet none the confession that mattered. As the clock marked midnight, I thought again of the tutor's whispered memory. Beware. Was it spoken to Fawkes, to him, or, uncomfortably, to me? The rain began once more, striking the panes with delicate persistence. I sat in the dim light, the photograph and the slip of paper before me, and wondered if perhaps the dead themselves were confessing not in words, but in fragments scattered across Oxford, waiting for me to gather them, waiting for me to hear. After the quadrangle, after the lights of Merton had been extinguished and the cloisters surrendered to the hush of midnight, I found myself walking alone. Lewis had retired, his patience worn thin by silences and shadows, but I could not yet follow him into sleep. The quadrangle lingered in my mind, the geometry of its stone, the echo of footsteps that seemed to belong not only to the living, but to those who had passed through centuries before. In Oxford, walking after midnight is never merely exercise. It is a conversation with ghosts. The rain had ceased, leaving the cobbles slick and gleaming under the faint lamps. I walked without aim, yet my feet carried me inevitably back toward the scene of it all, the chapel where Julian Fawkes had fallen. The gate creaked faintly as I pushed it, and the air within the quadrangle was colder than the streets beyond, as though the stones themselves held on to the memory of death. I paused beneath the tower, listening to the absence of bells. Their silence was louder than their sound. The city seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for me to acknowledge what I had resisted. Fawkes's fall was not an accident, nor merely a quarrel pushed too far. It was the conclusion of something older, a larger score written long ago, only now played to its end. From a window above, a light burned faintly. The tutor's rooms. I imagined him pacing, replaying his half-confession, torn between relief and dread. Elsewhere, perhaps, the dean sat with his ink-stained fingers, drafting a letter that would never be sent. And somewhere beyond, the walls, the woman in pale gloves drifted once more through the streets, carrying sandalwood into the night. I thought of them all as pieces on a board, but pieces that resisted arrangement. The photograph with its initials, the student's trembling letter, the scrap of paper in the library they know, the star symbol recurring like a refrain. Each clue spoke, but not in unison. Their voices crossed, collided, obscured, and I, the supposed solver of puzzles, could not yet align them. I lowered myself onto the cold stone step of the cloister and lit a cigarette. The smoke curled upward, joining the mist. I remembered Fawkes himself restless, fierce, convinced that hidden truths must be unearthed, even at the cost of friendships. Men like that are seldom mourned with honesty. Admiration and hatred coil together, indistinguishable. As I smoked, a memory surfaced, a crossword clue from the morning, ignored in haste. 10 letters, place where silence lives. I had left it blank, but the answer came now with cruel clarity. Quadrangle, not just a courtyard of stone, but a place where silence multiplies, where secrets echo against walls until they are smothered. After the quadrangle, the title wrote itself in my head, comes only the attempt to live with what cannot be spoken. That was the truth Oxford taught more than any manuscript or lecture. I stood at last, walking slowly across the flagstones. Each step seemed louder than it should, and for a moment I thought I heard another pair behind me. When I turned, there was no one, only the echo of my own tread. Yet I could not shake the sense of being observed, judged perhaps by eyes too patient to be mortal. At the chapel door I hesitated. The verger had locked it, yet I imagined I could still hear the choir, faint, disembodied, singing their rehearsal notes into the void. I imagined Fawkes at the loft rail, leaning too far, the faint scent of sandalwood in the air. The scene repeated again and again, not yielding clarity but deepening into ritual. Oxford makes rituals of accidents, I thought. It baptizes them in secrecy until they become part of the stone. One day, long after I am gone, students will walk here and feel only a chill without knowing why. The quadrangle will have absorbed it, as it absorbs all things. When I left the gate, the mist thickened, blurring the lamps into halos. I crossed the High, the city emptied of traffic, and made my way back toward my rooms. On the way I passed the Radcliffe camera, its dome ghostly in the fog. I paused there, remembering the student who had pressed Fawkes's copy into my hand, his eyes wide with fear. I wondered if he slept, or if he, too, lay awake, listening for footsteps that never arrived. The Bodleian loomed beside me, its walls unreadable. Somewhere inside the inscription remained Veritas Vincit. But even as I mouthed the words, I knew their irony. Truth does not conquer here. It hides, it whispers, it waits. At best, it survives, etched faintly in margins. I reached my rooms and found the desk as I had left it, the photograph, the copied letter, the slip with "they know." I laid them out as though they might arrange themselves into coherence. But they remained stubborn, fragments only. I poured a whiskey and stared at them, my eyes blurring with fatigue. Lewis would want answers in the morning, the college would want closure, the city would want silence. But all I could offer was this: after the quadrangle there is only the haunting of what cannot be said. A false solution tempts, a true one terrifies, and so we circle, half-seeing, half-hearing, until time itself writes the ending. I wrote one final note in my book before closing it. The star returns, but not yet explained. The woman remains unnamed. The coin is still missing. The quadrangle is silent. Then I extinguished the lamp, leaving only the faint glimmer of rain against the window. I lay down, listening to the city breathe, and in the hush between bell strokes I felt, more than thought, the presence of Fawkes still among us, waiting for the truth to be spoken or buried, or both. After the quadrangle, there is no neat conclusion, only echoes, fragments, and the ache of questions that refuse to quieten.